In July of 1861, in the scorching heat of Montgomery, Alabama, a 13-year-old boy was placed on a wooden platform and sold. Not his shoes. Not his labor. Not his time. Him. His name was James, and as the crowd of men circled him like he was livestock at a county fair, inspecting his teeth, calculating his worth in dollars, James did something nobody expected. He looked up. Not at the men bidding on him. Not at the overseer with his rope. Not at his mother, standing 30 feet away, separated from him by a rope, and a man on horseback whose only job was to make sure she couldn't cross it. James looked at the sky. Because the sky didn't belong to Harold Calloway. The sky wasn't in anybody's ledger. The sky was free, and if James couldn't be free yet, then at the very least, he was going to look at something that was. That one moment, a boy choosing where to direct his eyes on the worst day of his life, tells you everything you need to know about who James Freeman was. This is not a story about slavery breaking a person. This is a story about what happens when chains meet a soul that was never designed to be contained. A story about a boy who was told he was property and spent the rest of his life proving he was a force. So settle in. Because James Elijah Freeman has something to say, and he didn't survive everything he survived for you to look away. This is The Unbroken. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. Help me show her that real-life stories like this matter and deserve to be heard by liking the video, where you are watching from, share it with someone, and make sure to subscribe. The morning James Elijah Calloway came into the world, his grandmother said the sky split open with lightning, not the angry kind that brings destruction, but the kind that illuminates everything it touches, if only for a moment. She said the old oak tree at the edge of the Calloway plantation trembled its leaves like hands clapping, and that 2 mockingbirds landed on the windowsill of the slave cabin and sang a song nobody had ever heard before and nobody would ever hear again. That boy, his grandmother Nana Ruth whispered to his mother, Dessa, as she pressed the newborn against her chest, was not born for this ground. Nobody knew quite what she meant. Not then. James was born in the late winter of 1848, on the Calloway cotton plantation 12 miles south of Montgomery, Alabama, where the land was flat and red and thirsty, and the cotton stretched in rows so long that a child could walk the length of a field and forget where he had started. The plantation belonged to a man named Harold Calloway, a lean, pinch-faced man with small eyes and large ambitions, who owned 43 enslaved people, not including the children, because in Harold Calloway's ledger, children were listed under future assets, which was perhaps the most honest thing he ever wrote down. James's father, a man named Solomon, was tall and deliberate in everything he did, like a man who had decided long ago to move through the world with purpose, because purpose was the one thing nobody could strip from him. Solomon worked the fields from before sunrise until the stars came back out, and yet every evening he found a way to sit beside young James and talk. Not about cotton. Not about the overseer's whip or the weight of the picking sack or the ache in his back. Solomon talked about the world beyond the red Alabama clay. There are cities, Solomon would say, his voice low and warm, like embers, where colored men walk on cobblestone and own their own shoes. Cities where a man's children belong to him and not to somebody else's ledger. Where? James would ask, his eyes enormous. North, his father would say simply. Always north. James grew up with 3 gifts that would, in time, save his life. The first gift was his mind. From the time he could speak in full sentences, James possessed a memory so precise it unsettled even those who loved him. He could hear a thing once, a song, a direction, a conversation whispered between adults and carry it with him word for word, note for note, for years. The other children called it a trick. Nana Ruth called it a treasury. The second gift was his hands. Not in the way the overseer valued hands for picking, hauling, and enduring pain. James's hands were clever in the architectural sense. He could look at a broken thing and understand it the way a surgeon understands the body intuitively, structurally, knowing where the break was and how the pieces were meant to fit together. By the time he was 7, he was the one the older men called when a wagon wheel cracked or a plow blade bent. He would crouch over the broken object, turn it in his hands, and quietly repair it. The third gift was his feet, or rather, his sense of direction. James never got lost. Not in the thick pine woods behind the plantation, not in the winding creek beds that cut through the red hills, not even in the dark. He carried the world's geography inside him like a compass needle, always pointing home, or rather, always pointing away. His mother, Dessa, noticed all 3 gifts and was terrified by them. She had lived long enough on this earth to understand that a gifted enslaved child was not safer for being gifted. Gifts attracted attention. Attention attracts danger. She pulled James close on the nights he became too curious, too bold, too loud in his observations. "You are not invisible," she whispered to him. "And that means you have to be careful." But James was 10 years old, and 10-year-old boys with fire in their chests are not built for carefulness. It was in the spring of 1858, James was not quite 10, that he first learned to read. This was not a simple thing. In Alabama, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read or write. The law understood something that the slaveholders liked to pretend was not true, that literacy was a door, and once a man's mind walked through that door, no chain was strong enough to drag it back. The teacher was not who you might expect. His name was Mr. Obadiah Presley, and he was a white man, a carpenter brought in from Montgomery to repair the plantation's main house after a section of the upper floor collapsed. Mr. Presley was a quiet, bearded Quaker, a man of mild manners and ferocious private conviction. He had no interest in politics, no appetite for speeches or pamphlets. He simply believed, with the unshakable certainty of a man who had examined his conscience and found his answer there, that every human being had the right to read the Word of God. He noticed James watching him work the very first morning. The boy crouched at a respectful distance, head tilted, studying the way Presley measured and cut and joined. By the third day, when Presley accidentally miscalculated the angle on a support beam, it was James who quietly said, from 12 feet away, "The angle is off by about 2 degrees, sir." Presley straightened, stared at the boy, measured again. The boy was right. "How did you know that?" Presley asked. James shrugged in the careful way of a child who has learned not to reveal too much of himself. It looked wrong. Presley worked on the plantation for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, in the half hours between tasks, in the shadows of the woodshed, he taught James the alphabet, then short words, then longer ones. He brought a small Bible from his bag and let James hold it, run his fingers along the letters, connect the shapes to the sounds he was learning. By the time Presley left, James could read simple passages and write his own name. He scratched his name into the dirt behind Nana Ruth's cabin and stared at it for a long time. James. He did not yet know his last name. Enslaved people were not given last names, or rather, they were given their master's name, and James had decided, in the wordless way that children sometimes make permanent decisions, that he would never be James Calloway. He would find his own name when he found his own life. Solomon found out about the reading and said nothing for 3 days. Then one evening he gripped his son by both shoulders and looked at him with eyes that carried whole decades in them. "If they find out," Solomon said, "they will hurt you." "I know," James said. "But knowing how to read," Solomon continued, his grip tightening, "is the beginning of the road north. So you keep it. You hide it deep. You water it in secret, and when the time comes, and it will come, you use it." James never forgot those words. He stored them in his treasury alongside everything else. The summer of 1861 arrived in Alabama like a fever, hot, restless, and breaking everything it touched. It was the year the war began. In April, Confederate guns had opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the whole terrible machinery of the Civil War lurched into motion. In Montgomery, which was, for a brief and self-important moment, the capital of the Confederacy, white men in gray uniforms marched through the streets with flags and band music, and the newspapers spoke of glory and sovereignty and a way of life worth defending. In the slave quarters of the Callaway plantation, nobody was fooled. "Something is shifting," Solomon told James one night. "When the ground shakes, boy, you pay attention. Even the worm underground feels it." But before any shift could save them, disaster came first. Harold Callaway had gambling debts, a fact he had managed to conceal for 2 years behind a facade of prosperous indifference. By the summer of 1861, the debts had grown into something monstrous. Callaway's creditors were no longer patient men. And so, in July of that year, Harold Callaway did what men in his position had always done. He went to his ledger, found the entries marked future assets, and began to make decisions. James was 13 years old. He was sold on a Tuesday morning in July, at the auction yard in Montgomery, alongside 4 other enslaved men and women from the Callaway plantation. His mother stood 30 feet away, separated from him by a length of rope, and a man on horseback who existed specifically to ensure that she did not cross it. She did not cry. James would remember this for the rest of his life, not because she was cold, but because she had already cried every tear she on the night before, in the dark of their cabin, holding him so tightly he could feel her heartbeat against his ribs. By morning, she had made herself into stone, because stone was what he needed to see. She needed her boy to see a face that said, "You will survive this. You are built for more than this moment." James stood on the auction block and did not look at the crowd. He looked at the sky. It was the deep, brilliant blue of a southern July, enormous and indifferent. And James, with his extraordinary memory, memorized it. The exact shade. The single white cloud drifting southeast. The way the light fell. He memorized it the way you memorize a face you know you may never see again. He was purchased for $420 by a man named Reginald Beaumont, a cotton planter from Lowndes County, 40 miles south of Montgomery, on a stretch of the Black Belt that local people called, with grim accuracy, the Dark Mile for the darkness of the soil, they said, though everyone knew there were other reasons for the name. As the wagon carried him away, James turned and looked back once. His mother had moved to the edge of the rope. She pressed one hand flat against her chest, against her heart and held it there. James pressed his own hand against his chest and held it there. Then the wagon turned a corner and she was gone. The Beaumont plantation was larger than Callaway's in every dimension, more acreage, more enslaved workers, more cruelty in its systems if not always in its individual moments. Reginald Beaumont was not, by the standards of his time and place, considered a brutal man. He did not take particular pleasure in punishment. He simply ran his operation the way he ran his accounts, efficiently, impersonally, and with absolute conviction that the people whose labor sustained his wealth were not quite people in the full sense of the word. His overseer, a man named Grady Pierce, was a different matter. Pierce was a compact, red-necked man with a drooping mustache and a talent for identifying the specific cruelty most likely to break a particular person. He had been breaking people for 16 years, and he was, by any objective measure, very good at it. James arrived at the Beaumont plantation on a Thursday afternoon and was assigned to the cotton fields by Friday morning. He had never worked a full day in the fields before. At Callaway's, his gifts had kept him close to the main house and the repair yard. Now there was no sanctuary. The picking sack went over his shoulder like a punishment, and for the first 2 weeks his hands bled and his back screamed and he fell into his sleeping pallet each night before he had fully finished eating. But James did not break. He refused to break for reasons that had nothing to do with stubbornness. He refused to break because he was building something inside himself during those first terrible weeks, a kind of architecture of survival. He was studying the plantation the way he had studied broken wagon wheels, looking for the structure beneath, identifying where the joints were, understanding how the whole thing held together, so that he could one day understand how it came apart. He watched everything. He watched the patterns of the overseer's rounds, what time Pierce made his first pass through the fields, when he broke for his midday meal, which sections of the plantation he left unwalked on any given afternoon. He watched the roads that led away from the property, how many led north, how many were watched. He watched the stars at night through the gap in the cabin roof. He learned to read them not as poetry but as a map. He also found, in those early weeks, the person who would become his closest companion at Beaumont's. Her name was Clara. Clara was 15, 2 years older than James, and she had been on the Beaumont plantation since she was 8. She was small and compact, with a serious face that rarely smiled but whose eyes, when she was moved by something, filled with a warmth so sudden it was almost shocking. She had survived 7 years of the Dark Mile by cultivating a skill James immediately recognized as a mirror of his own. She collected knowledge. While James collected geography and structure, Clara collected people. She knew every enslaved person on the plantation by name, history, temperament, and longing. She knew which of the house servants occasionally overheard conversations between Beaumont and his guests. She knew which of the white hired hands were secretly sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, or at least made uncomfortable by what they witnessed. She was, without knowing the term, a natural intelligence gatherer, and she had, in her years at Beaumont's, built something that James did not yet know the word for but would later understand as a network. Clara took one look at James when he arrived and said, without introduction, "You're not planning to stay." He stared at her. "What makes you say that?" "Your eyes," she said. "You look at fences like they're temporary." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Aren't they?" Clara almost smiled. "Come sit with us at supper," she said. "There are people you should know." The people James needed to know gathered in the evenings at the far end of the slave quarters, in a space behind an old smokehouse where the overseer's lamplight didn't reach. There were 6 of them, varying in age from Clara's 15 to an old man named Cujo who was somewhere between 60 and 70 and had been enslaved since before anyone in the group had been born. What they shared, these 6 people, was a particular quality of mind, the quality of not having surrendered the future to the present. They talked about escaping the way other people talk about weather, not if, but when. Not whether, but how. Cujo was their historian. He told stories about runaways he had known, men and women who had run north and sometimes made it, and sometimes did not, and what the difference had been. He spoke of the Underground Railroad, which James had heard whispered about but never understood clearly. He explained it not as a single organization but as a web of courage, free black people, Quakers, secret sympathizers, safe houses, coded signals, hidden passages. A whole invisible country built inside the visible one. "The road is there," Cujo said one evening, his voice like dry leaves in the wind. "Always has been. But you have to know how to see it." James listened with his entire body. He was 14. He was 5 years from his escape. He did not know this yet. But he was already building toward it, in the way that a river, long before it finds the sea, is already shaping the valley through which it will one day flow. The years on the Beaumont plantation were not merely years of suffering, though they were certainly that. They were also years of an education that no school building could have provided. James grew. At 15 he was already tall, and by 17 he had his father Solomon's broad shoulders and deliberate way of moving, but it was the growth of his mind that was most significant. He found, in the years after his arrival, several more hidden teachers. The first was a free black man named Thomas, a blacksmith who came to the plantation twice a year to make repairs that the resident hands couldn't manage. Thomas was technically free. He had purchased his own freedom 12 years earlier through years of saved wages, but freedom for a black man in Alabama in 1862 was a complicated and conditional thing. Thomas navigated his freedom carefully, moving through white spaces with precisely calibrated deference, saying exactly as much as was safe and never a syllable more. But in the blacksmith shed, when the overseer was occupied elsewhere, Thomas talked to James in a completely different register. He told him about the political situation, the progress of the war, the debates in Washington, and the growing power of the abolitionist movement in the North. He told James about Frederick Douglass, whose narrative had shaken the nation, and about Harriet Tubman, who had by that point led dozens of enslaved people north through the darkness and danger of the Underground Railroad. "She's real," Thomas said one afternoon, his hammer ringing against iron. "Not a legend. A real woman. She went back. 13 times she went back south and brought people out." James sat with this information for weeks. The idea of going back, of freedom not merely as personal escape but as a responsibility toward others, planted itself in him like a seed. The second teacher was unexpected. Her name was Miss Alice Beaumont, the planter's youngest daughter, 17 years old, who had been educated by a northern tutor before the war cut off that arrangement. Miss Alice was not a good person by any definitive measure. She was a product of her world and held its assumptions without questioning them. But she loved books the way some people love air, and in the chaos of wartime, with the main house understaffed and the usual social barriers somewhat loosened by anxiety, she sometimes left books in places where they could be found. James believed these placements were not entirely accidental. He could never prove it, but more than once, he found a volume tucked in an unlikely location, inside the repair shed, once beneath the edge of the stable wall, that he subsequently read cover to cover and returned to the same place. Through Miss Alice's library, James read the Columbian Orator, the same collection of speeches about liberty and justice that Frederick Douglass himself had read as a young enslaved man. He read histories of ancient Rome, which gave him his first formal understanding of how societies built on forced labor had eventually collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. He read political philosophy, fragments of it, imperfectly understood but absorbed, metabolized, converted into the substance of something growing inside him. He was becoming, without knowing the word for it, an intellectual, a man whose inner life was wider than the world around him, whose thoughts extended far beyond the boundaries of the dark mile. This made him dangerous. Grady Pierce, the overseer, noticed the change in James without being able to name it. James worked hard, harder than most, in fact, because slackness attracted punishment and punishment was a distraction he could not afford. He made no trouble. He kept his eyes down when Pierce was present. But Pierce had spent 16 years studying enslaved people, and he had developed a sense for a particular kind of stillness, the stillness of a man who was waiting for something, who was building toward something. "That boy," Pierce told Beaumont one evening, "is thinking too much." Beaumont looked up from his account books with the mild irritation of a man interrupted during important work. "Grady, they don't think." Pierce said nothing more. But he began to watch James more carefully. James was 17 when Clara told him she was ready to run. They had been talking about it in fragments for 3 years in the moments between work and sleep, in the coded language they had developed for speaking about dangerous things openly. But that evening, behind the smokehouse, Clara said it plainly. "I found a contact," she said. "A free black woman, her name is Josephine. She lives in Selma. She can get us to the first station on the railroad. James looked at her. How did you find this? Thomas, she said. He's been carrying messages. He's been doing it for years. James felt a familiar sensation, that internal compass spinning, recalibrating. He had known this moment was coming. He had been preparing for it for 3 years. And yet, sitting with its sudden realness, he felt the full weight of what it meant. If they ran and were caught, they would be beaten. If they ran a second time, they might be sold further south, to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the work and the conditions were so much worse that enslaved people spoke of being sold south in the same hushed terror that other people spoke of death. If they were caught a third time, or if they were considered dangerous enough, they might be hanged, or worse, made into an example. James thought of his mother pressing her hand against her heart. He thought of his father saying north. Always north. He thought of Harriet Tubman going back 13 times. Not yet, he said. Clara's eyes hardened. James? Not yet, he repeated. 2 more months. I need 2 more months. In those 2 months, James completed his preparation. He memorized every road, path, creek bed, and tree line within 20 miles of the plantation, cross-referencing what he had learned from Thomas with what he had observed during his years of field work. He arranged, through a carefully calibrated series of conversations with Thomas, for the contact chain to the north to be confirmed and double confirmed. He built, in secret, a pair of solid walking shoes from scraps of leather, because he had learned from Cujo that the most common reason recaptured runaways were caught was because their feet gave out. And he identified one more thing, the night. The specific night he chose was a Saturday in late October, not because it was safer than other nights, but because on Saturday evenings, Grady Pierce rode to the nearest town and did not return until Sunday morning. The dogs would still need to be managed. James had been feeding the plantation hounds scraps for months, slowly building their association of him with reward rather than threat, but the human eyes would be reduced. The night he chose also coincided with a new moon. No light. Perfect darkness for a boy whose compass never needed the stars. They ran at 2 in the morning. There were 4 of them in the end, James and Clara, and 2 others from the smokehouse group, a man named Henry, who was 22 and had attempted escape once before and been caught, and Henry's younger sister, Patience, who was 15 and had her brother's fierceness and twice his stamina. They crossed the cotton fields in single file, James at the front, moving in the crouch that instinctively makes a person smaller against the dark horizon. The October air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and coming rain, rain that James had been watching the sky for, because rain washed scent from the ground and confused tracking dogs. They reached the tree line without incident. Then they ran not in a panic. Panic was how you twisted your ankle, how you ran past the path you were looking for, how you made noise that carried. James moved through the darkness the way water moves through rock, finding the path of least resistance, reading the ground through the soles of his leather shoes, letting his internal compass guide him northeast toward the creek he had mapped in his mind. Clara ran just behind him, close enough to touch his shoulder. Behind her, Patience moved with a silent efficiency that surprised everyone. Henry brought up the rear, his breathing steady and controlled the breathing of a man who had learned from his first, failed attempt. They moved for 3 hours without stopping. Then James found the creek and followed it north for another 2 hours, walking in the water to break the scent trail, stepping from stone to leave no prints in the mud. By the time dawn began to gray the edges of the sky, they were 9 miles from the plantation. They hid in a hollow beneath an uprooted pine tree, covered with leaves and branches, and slept in turns while the world woke up around them. The journey north took 22 days. It was not a single continuous run but a series of movements, each one dangerous, each one dependent on a chain of strangers whose courage was both remarkable and, in the brutal mathematics of the time, not unreasonable to fear. A safe house compromise could mean the imprisonment of a dozen people. Every person who opened a door was offering their safety, possibly their life. The first safe house was a black family's small farm outside Selma, Josephine's place, exactly as Clara had said. Josephine was a short, wide-shouldered woman in her 40s who opened her door at the agreed-upon knock with the composed expression of someone who had opened that door many times before. She fed them. She let them sleep in her cellar. She gave them information about the next point north, a white Quaker family 20 miles away, on the edge of a town called Orville. James lay in Josephine's cellar that night listening to the others breathing and thought about what it meant that this woman who risked everything had built her life around this door. He thought about the word Cujo had used, network. He was inside it now, and it felt less like an organization and more like a living thing, like a body with a pulse, kept alive by the heartbeats of hundreds of individual people who had each made the same private decision. He wanted to be part of keeping it alive. But that was for later. For now, north. Always north. They crossed into Ohio on a cold night in November, at a ferry crossing operated by an old black man who asked no questions and charged no fee and looked at them with eyes that had seen so many crossings that his expression was simply the expression of a man who had accepted that this was what the world asked of him. And he would do it as long as he could. When James's feet touched Ohio ground for the first time, he stopped walking. Clara looked back at him. James. He was breathing very slowly. His eyes were closed. The cold air moved around them. James, she said again, softer. I'm listening, he said. To what? To what free sounds like. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she stood beside him and closed her own eyes. They stood there for nearly 2 minutes, the four of them, listening to the dark Ohio River country, the wind in the bare trees, the water below, the distant howl of something, and all of it sounded different from Alabama. All of it sounded like a door that had swung open and was waiting. The city of Cincinnati received them in early December of 1865. The war had by then been concluded, the Confederacy defeated, and the 13th Amendment ratified, abolishing slavery constitutionally. But for James, Clara, Henry, and Patience, freedom had arrived not as a political event but as a physical crossing of a river in the dark. The law's arrival was almost beside the point. Almost. Because what James understood, within his first weeks in Cincinnati, was that the law's arrival was entirely the point for millions of people who had not yet crossed their river. 4 million enslaved people had been freed by the 13th Amendment, but freedom in law and freedom in life were different countries, and the distance between them was measured in economics, violence, education, land, and political power, all of which were being contested, in the South's ruins and the North's corridors of power, with furious intensity. James settled in Cincinnati's black community, in a neighborhood of narrow houses and wide ambitions, where formerly enslaved people, freeborn black Northerners, and a scattering of sympathetic white allies were trying to figure out what came next. He found work first as a carpenter's assistant, his hands remembered everything, and then, as word spread of his abilities, as a full carpenter working independently. He sent money south whenever he could, through networks that were no longer secret and no longer illegal. He sent letters to the Callaway plantation, searching for word of his mother. He wrote in his clear, self-taught hand, the letters a mixture of formal education gleaned from stolen books and the raw directness of a man who has never had patience for unnecessary decoration. He found his mother's trail in the spring of 1866. She was alive. She had been sold twice after James, once to a planter in Georgia, then again to another in Mississippi, but she was alive and working as a domestic servant in Memphis, Tennessee, where she had ended up after the war's end scattered the old plantation order. He wrote to her and waited 6 weeks for the letter to travel south and her response to travel north. Her response came on a Tuesday morning. James sat on the steps of his rented room and opened it with hands that, for the first time in years, were not entirely steady. My James, she had written in a hand taught to her, he would later learn, by a missionary school that had opened for freed people in Memphis. My James. So you made it. Your grandmother always said you would. I always said so too, though I did not always believe it because a mother cannot always hold hope steady. But here you are. North. And here I am. Not north yet. But north is a direction and I know which way it is. Your mother, Dessa. He pressed the letter against his chest the way she had pressed her hand against her heart on the auction block. Then he dried his eyes and went back to work. It was in Cincinnati, in the fall of 1866, that James Elijah Callaway, who had by then quietly and permanently renamed himself James Elijah Freeman, first attended a meeting of the local branch of the American Anti-Slavery Society. The war was over. Slavery was, technically, ended. The Anti-Slavery Society had debated disbanding. Some of its leaders argued that the fight was won. Others, including Frederick Douglass, argued that the abolition of legal slavery was only the beginning, that without economic freedom, land, education, and political rights, the 4 million freed people would find themselves bound by new chains invisible, but just as effective as the old iron ones. James sat in the back of the meeting room, in a church hall that smelled of candle wax and wood smoke, and listened to a man named Reverend Absalom Cray make this argument with a fierce and rolling eloquence that reminded James of the night sky over the dark mile, vast, overwhelming, full of points of light. When the meeting opened for discussion, James did not speak. He was not ready. He listened. He came back the following week. And the week after that. He began to read everything he could find, newspapers, pamphlets, Douglass's writings, the reports coming out of Congress about Reconstruction. His mind, trained since childhood to store and connect information, assembled a picture of the political situation that was as comprehensive as anything the most dedicated activists in the room possessed. By the third month, he began to speak. He was not, at first, a polished speaker. He spoke the way he repaired things methodically, structurally, identifying the break and explaining how the pieces were meant to fit together. He did not have Reverend Cray's thunder or Douglas's soaring rhetoric. What he had was clarity. When James Freeman spoke, people could not find a gap in his reasoning. He spoke the way rivers run, not dramatically, but inevitably. People began to listen. By 1867, James Freeman was 20 years old and had become one of the most active organizers in Cincinnati's black political community. His work had expanded far beyond the anti-slavery society. He was involved in voter registration efforts for black men. The 15th Amendment giving black men the right to vote was still 2 years away, but the organizing had to start now. He was involved in the Freedmen schools being established throughout the region, donating his carpentry skills to repair and build schoolrooms, and his literacy to teach evening classes for adults who had been kept from reading their entire lives. And he was involved, still, in something older and more urgent, the remnants of the Underground Railroad adapted for the new moment, helping formerly enslaved people who were making the journey north navigate the chaos of the post-war landscape, find housing, find work, reconnect with scattered families. Clara had become a teacher in the Freedmen's School. Henry worked at a foundry and had joined the colored militia. Patience had married a man from Kentucky and lived 2 streets over, and her firstborn son was named, at her insistence, James. And James himself was becoming something he could not entirely recognize in the mirror. He brought his mother north in the winter of 1867. He had saved enough from his carpentry work to pay for her passage, and to set up a small room for her in a house around the corner from his own. When he met her at the Cincinnati landing, she had come up the river by steamboat, the same waters that his own escape had crossed. He was unprepared for how small she looked, not diminished. Dessa Freeman was not a woman who diminished, but human, mortal. A woman whose body had carried 19 years of labor and loss. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. She looked at his height, his broad shoulders, his eyes, Solomon's eyes, she told him later, the same deep brown-black, the same quality of looking at a thing and seeing through it to its structure. Your father would have liked what you've become, she said. James swallowed. Where is he? She was quiet for just a moment too long. He ran in 1863, she said. After the Emancipation Proclamation. They caught him at the Alabama River. A silence. He didn't make it, James said. No, she said. But he ran. He ran to the river. That was Solomon. She straightened, and something in her face became the stone face she had worn at the auction block, except this time it was not armor against grief but against the gravity of the past. Now, show me this city. In the following years, James Freeman's work expanded in all directions simultaneously. He traveled south on several occasions, dangerous journeys, requiring careful planning and the network of contacts he had spent years cultivating to assist with voter registration efforts in Alabama and Georgia during the hopeful early years of Reconstruction. He spoke at meetings in churches, in fields, in the open air of courthouse squares where black men, for the first time in American history, were being registered to cast ballots. He saw former enslavers watch this process from behind courthouse windows with expressions that told him everything about what was coming. Reconstruction's promise was being contested at every level, and the violence used to suppress black political participation was systematic, organized, and often endorsed by the same men who had worn Confederate gray. James began to write. It started as pamphlets, short, argument-dense documents that he had printed at a sympathetic printer's shop and distributed through the network. Then it expanded to letters to newspapers, first the black press, then, increasingly, white abolitionist publications in Boston and New York that were hungry for the perspective of a formerly enslaved man who could write with James Freeman's precision and force. Frederick Douglass read one of James's articles in 1869 and wrote him a letter. James kept that letter, folded to the size of a playing card in his breast pocket for the rest of his life. In it, Douglass wrote that James's voice was needed, that the movement needed men who had lived the thing and could also think and write and speak it, that the work of Reconstruction was not finished and would not be finished by Congress alone. It will be finished, Douglass wrote, by the accumulated voices and organizing power of those who have most at stake in its outcome. Men like you, Mr. Freeman, who know that the law is only the beginning, and that the real building comes after. James read this on the steps of his mother's house on a cold February morning, with Cincinnati waking up around him, horses and carts and chimney smoke and children running, and felt, for perhaps the first time in his life, a sensation he could not immediately name. He sat with it for a while. Then he named it. purpose. Not survival. Not escape. Not the fierce forward motion of a man fleeing something. This was different. This was the sensation of moving towards something, of being exactly where the current of his life had always been carrying him, of being, in his grandmother Nana Ruth's phrase, not made for this ground but made for this work. James Freeman was invited to speak at a major abolitionist convention in Boston in the fall of 1870. By then he was 22, and his reputation had traveled far enough that the organizers had specifically sought him out. They wanted a speaker who had been enslaved, who had escaped, who had organized in the South, and who could speak to both the moral argument and the political mechanics of what the movement needed to do next. He traveled to Boston by train, which was itself a kind of miracle, a formerly enslaved boy from Alabama riding in a rail car through the changing American landscape, watching the country unspool outside the window, thinking about what he was going to say. He had never spoken to an audience this large. The convention was held in Faneuil Hall, the same building where generations of Americans had argued about liberty, where the abolitionists of an earlier era had been shouted down and sometimes assaulted. It held 1,000 people. The 1,000 people on this particular evening were a mixture of black and white, activists and politicians, journalists and ministers and former soldiers. James stood at the podium and looked out at them and thought of his mother pressing her hand against her heart at the auction block. He thought of his father's voice, north. Always north. He thought of Cujo in the dark behind the smokehouse. He thought of Clara naming his ambition before he had named it himself. He thought of the people who had opened doors along the road north, who had offered shelter at the cost of their own safety. He began to speak. He told them about the auction block specifically, with the carpenter's precision that never left him, every physical detail. The red Alabama July sky. The smell of the crowd. The rope that kept his mother 30 feet away. He spoke without drama, without embellishment, because he had learned by then that the truth, delivered plainly, had more power than any ornamentation. He told them about the dark years of labor on the Beaumont plantation, not to summon pity, but to explain the architecture of the system, how it worked, what it required, how it sustained itself through a combination of law, violence, economic incentive, and the deliberate deprivation of education. Then he told them something that no one had said in quite this way at this kind of gathering. The chains are off, he said, and the hall was so quiet that his voice seemed enormous. The law says they are off. And I stand here as a man who felt them and who does not feel them now, and I can tell you that the law's removal of chains is necessary, and it is not sufficient because what the chains restrained was not just the body. They restrained the mind. They restrained the economy. They restrained the vote, and you cannot free a man's body on a Tuesday and expect his mind to be free by Wednesday, when he has no school, no land, no political representation, no protection under a law that was not written with his dignity in mind. He paused. We are not at the end of a fight, he said. We are at the beginning of a longer, harder, less dramatic fight, and it requires not just marches and speeches. It requires schools. It requires land. It requires lawyers and legislators and newspapers and men and women who understand that freedom is not an event. Freedom is an infrastructure, and we must build it, plank by plank, the way I learned to build things from the ground up, with our own hands, knowing what we are doing and refusing to stop until it holds weight. The hall was silent for a moment. Then it was not. James Elijah Freeman spent the remaining decades of his life building what he had described in Faneuil Hall. He founded a school for freed people in Cincinnati that, within 5 years, had educated over 400 adults in literacy and arithmetic. He partnered with other organizers to establish a legal aid network for black families in Ohio and Indiana who were navigating the complicated legal terrain of the post-war period. He continued to write articles, pamphlets, and eventually a memoir, completed in 1884, which described his life from the auction block to the convention halls of the North with the same clear-eyed precision that had always been his signature. Clara became the school's principal. Henry rose to become a respected figure in Cincinnati's black business community. Patience's son James, named for his father's friend, grew up to be a lawyer. Dessa Freeman lived into her 80s. On the evening before she died, James sat beside her bed and read to her from the Bible, the same book a quiet Quaker carpenter had once placed in his hands in a woodshed in Alabama, and she listened with her eyes closed and a small smile on her face that was, he thought, the same smile she must have given the newborn version of him on the night the mockingbirds came. You found your name, she said, when he had finished reading. Yes, he said. Freeman, she said, and let the word rest in the air for a moment. Your grandmother would have liked it. What do you think she would have said? James asked. Dessa was quiet for so long he thought she had fallen asleep. Then she said, I think she would have said you were not born for that ground. And I think she would have been right. James held her hand until she slept. The last thing recorded in James Freeman's memoir is a passage he wrote in the spring of 1885, when he was 37 years old and the promise of Reconstruction was being dismantled piece by piece in the South, and the long shadow of Jim Crow was beginning to fall, and the fight he had warned the Boston Convention would be long and hard and less dramatic was proving him right in ways that broke his heart and did not extinguish his determination. He wrote, "I have been asked many times whether I am discouraged. I have been asked whether the current darkness suggests that the work was wasted, that the sacrifice was in vain, that the chains we broke are being refashioned. I answer this way. I was 13 years old on an auction block in Montgomery in July, in a heat so fierce it made the air shimmer, and I looked up at the sky because I did not want to look at what was in front of me. And the sky was blue, a blue so complete and absolute that it seemed impossible, in that moment, that the world beneath it could be so broken. But both things were true. The broken world was true and the blue sky was true. I have learned, in the years since, to hold both truths at once. The darkness is real. The road is long. The fight is far from finished and the sky is still blue. The door is open. The road goes north. And as long as there is a single person still in chains, visible or invisible, iron or economic, legal or social, there is work left to do. I intend to do it. I was not born for any ground that tells me to stop." James Elijah Freeman. Born in bondage, 1848. Sold at auction, 1861. Escaped to freedom, 1865. Died a free man, in Cincinnati, Ohio, 1921. Age 73. Buried with a Bible, a carpenter's chisel, and a letter in his breast pocket, folded to the size of a playing card. On his headstone, per his own written instruction, 4 words. He was not finished.